Thanks, David. And I echo exactly what Paul says about following the money. I mean, I think, for people who believe that a lab leak caused the pandemic really comes down to wasteful spending on unnecessary animal experiments in Wuhan and a lack of transparency and accountability about how that money was being spent. And I think there's three things that a congressional investigation needs to focus on is number one, a review of NIH foreign spending oversight. I met with the White House in January of 2020, before we had a pandemic, to warn them about foreign funding going to labs in China and Russia, in particular, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We flagged this for them. Nothing happened. 2.5 years later, today, Anthony Fauci could still write a check to the Institute of Virology for gain-of-function experiments and get it funded. So that shows how little action has been taken, that we could create the same problem that we're trying to fight now all over again. Nothing's happened since then. There's 29 laboratories in China today, including the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that are still eligible to receive taxpayer funding for animal experiments. In total, there's 350 laboratories in 50 other countries that the NIH is funding or has given eligibility to receive taxpayer funding for. And foreign laboratories are completely exempt from some key oversight that applies to domestic laboratories. So number one, we need a review of NIH's foreign spending. Obviously, we need a congressional review of gain-of-function oversight. We exposed that in 2016. Basically, a couple of NIH bureaucrats and an NIH grantee, Peter Daszak, rewrote the rules, rewrote the definition of gain-of-function in order to receive funding to conduct gain-of-function experiments. How can it possibly be that a couple of NIH bureaucrats and a conflicted NIH grantee can unilaterally redefine gain-of-function in order to skirt restrictions and receive taxpayer dollars? And how was Anthony Fauci able to lift the gain-of-function moratorium in 2017 with no public input, without the knowledge of Congress, and with virtually no input from the White House? I think at the time that the ban was lifted, there wasn't even a Secretary of HHS installed at the time. And more fundamentally, with regard to gain-of-function, what's been our return on investment for funding gain-of-function all these years in China or elsewhere? No pandemic has been prevented. In fact, a pandemic may have been caused. So why are we continuing to invest in infrastructure around gain-of-function, invest funding in gain-of-function, get congressional support and federal support behind gain-of-function when it hasn't done anything to improve public health and actually places it at risk, as people have been saying for decades? What do we have to show for gain-of-function other than 6 million dead people and a crippled global economy? And finally, I think we need to see a congressional review of NIH FOIA processing practices. And I think everyone on the call probably agrees about all of this, but particularly this. We're seeing FOIA requests come back with hundreds of completely redacted pages, documents that some organizations are receiving through FOIA, including ours, that have different redactions that other organizations are getting on the exact same documents. Excessive delays. We're constantly, White Coat Waste Project, US Right to Know, Judicial Watch, other organizations are constantly having to file lawsuits in order to get access to the records, never mind fighting about what's redacted and what's been excluded. And I just want to point out here that there is widespread bipartisan public support for everything we're talking about here. And I just want to give a little poll data from some public polls and some internal polls that we've been doing. June 2021 Politico Harvard poll, 52%, a majority of the public, a majority of Democrats, and a majority of Republicans believe that the pandemic was started as a result of a lab leak. Okay, so this isn't some fringe conspiracy theory as much as Anthony Fauci and some other people would like us to believe or like the public to believe. This is something that's mainstream. It's become mainstream, and a majority of the public across the aisle believes happened. According to polling we did in March 2021, 77% of taxpayers want US-led investigation into COVID origins. 84% of Republicans and 76% of Democrats say they want a US-led investigation into where COVID-19 came from. And finally, 75% of Americans also say that they want subpoenas. Specifically, we did polling showing that 75% of Republicans and Democrats want EcoHealth and Peter Daszak and anyone else involved in the gain-of-function experimentation at the Wuhan Institute of Virology to be subpoenaed to testify before Congress. So this is a mainstream issue. It has widespread bipartisan support. in public. Obviously, there's bipartisan support we're seeing in Congress. And I think there's a lot of areas of agreement, even if there's disagreement about what the ultimate origin of the pandemic was. I think there's a lot of agreement that we need to get to the bottom of what actually happened.